Now we will hear from two multinational companies who are leaders in the CSR movement. First, Leslie Croshaw, Senior Manager of Social and Environmental Sustainability for Levi Strauss. She is also responsible for factory compliance. Here she discusses how integrating the compliance team into the brands and with their sourcing partners has in fact improved business functions throughout the supply chain.
Sure. So I think like a lot of companies during the last few years, we've really worked on integrating our compliance team and work more closely with the actual business and with our sourcing partners. So while there may not be attributable direct benefits, the indirect benefits have been great. We've established more solid relationships with our business partners. They understand and support the work that we do and understand more about how their actions may affect the supplier's ability to reach and or maintain compliance. So that has been really key. And I think our business partners would agree, and with their support, we've really been able to see an improvement in our suppliers' performance.
Next, Monica Oberkoffler, Senior Manager, Gap Incorporated. She discusses working to create better practices with large multinational brands in an effort to limit audit fatigue at the factories and improve labor standards. Oberkoffler also introduces how the Gap works directly with NGOs to accomplish social compliance.
Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to quite an interesting discussion this afternoon. Hopefully we've got some good questions. I'd like to focus a little bit just on Gap's experience in the last 10 years with CSR standards, in particular labor standards for the factories that make our clothing. I think it's fair to say that our experience is very much tied to that of the apparel industry as a whole. Sweatshops have long been associated with apparel and footwear, arguably more so than they have been with other industries, although they certainly exist in a lot of places. As the apparel industry globalized in the 1980s and 1990s, sweatshops in developing countries, in particular those associated with U.S. and European retailers, became a topic of particular public concern. In 1991, Levi Strauss was the first company to develop a code of conduct to regulate labor standards in its third-party suppliers. A year later, Gap followed suit and developed its own internal sourcing guidelines, which outlined general labor standards for our suppliers. What neither we nor just about anybody else at the time realized was that simply outlining a set of standards isn't enough to bring about sustainable change. This is particularly true when you consider the types of supply chains that are common in this industry. They're mostly comprised of third-party suppliers that we don't own or operate, we just contract with them. This became abundantly clear to us in 1995. 3 years after we had developed our sourcing guidelines, we began to receive alarming reports of labor rights abuses at the Mandarin International Factory in El Salvador. When we sent down our employees to investigate, they returned with first-hand accounts of low pay, forced overtime, and reported union busting. It's fair to say that Mandarin was a wake-up call for us. It was clear that simply having a standard isn't enough. You also need to enforce that standard. So although a lot of other brands at Mandarin simply left, we decided to stay and try to be part of the solution. We partnered with 3 organizations, CSR, the Center for Reflection, Education and Action, and the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility to form an independent monitoring working group. And the group engaged TMAS, which is a Salvadorian civil society organization focused on the maquila sector, and this effort marked the first independent monitoring program in the industry. At the same time, we also began to build our internal monitoring program. In 1996, we revised our sourcing guidelines into our first Code of Vendor Conduct, which is still in place today, and it's based on the ILO core conventions. We also hired our first vendor compliance officer, whose sole job was to monitor factory conditions. Today, this team has expanded to over 90 individuals based in 25 countries around the world, and I'm part of this team. We've learned a lot in the last 10 years since Mandarin. First and foremost, we've seen that progress is possible, especially when a wide variety of stakeholders are engaged in the area. And probably the best example of this is child labor. It was tragically fairly widespread in the industry some years ago. I think it's fair to say that, particularly in factories that produce for multinational companies, it's not a common occurrence anymore. We've learned, though, that you can't make the kind of long-term progress that we want to make by working alone. A single company standard and enforcement of that standard isn't enough. For one thing, we're not the only company in the industry. Although we were one of the first to address the issue, many have now followed suit. And although this is a positive development because the more people focus, the better, one of the downsides is that manufacturers are now subject to multiple audits against multiple standards with varying degrees of remediation and follow-up. I think one of the best examples of this is fire extinguishers. I don't know if some of you are familiar with this, but I've seen it in some of our factories. Different companies have different regulations for what the fire extinguisher should be. So you go in and they've got several hooks on the wall, and depending on who's visiting, they just move the fire extinguisher around to get it to the requisite height. Now this is pretty ridiculous. This doesn't do anything for actually helping the workers, and it makes the manufacturers confused. So it's led to what we call audit fatigue.
Now we will hear from Michael Kabori, Vice President, Social and Environmental Sustainability at Levi Strauss & Company. Mr. Kabori also talks about the importance of working with other companies to share best practices. He shares the role that BSR, whose mission is to work with business to create a just and sustainable world, has had in helping Levi Strauss and other large multinational corporations to improve their business practices relative to CSR. And finally, Kabori touches on the challenge of consumer involvement. He challenges consumers to support companies who are working toward progress relative to advancing human rights conditions for all workers everywhere.
One company only too aware of the need to keep the customer satisfied is Levi Strauss.
I think we were actually the first company to establish global labor standards with all of our suppliers around the world. That was back in 1991.
This ethic continues within the company today. The code covering the supply chain extends beyond the 800 Levi's factories and their 315,000 workers. Thanks to the work of BSR, a consultancy that helps companies ensure sustainable supply chains. Many of the other big names which share suppliers now collaborate to make whole industries more transparent and accountable.
Through BSR's influence in bringing other companies to the table, the work is expanded, it's multiplied. So now we're affecting thousands of factories and literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of workers around the world.
BSR is a consultancy which has made corporate responsibility its business. Founded in 1992, BSR now works with 250 companies worldwide and counts sustainable supply chain management amongst its successes.
What we do is bring the right players, whether it's multinational corporations, it's Levi's, it's Gap, it's Nike, to the table and get them to really drive consensus when they're actually making decisions.
By working collectively, BSR and the businesses it works with have been able to cut costs by sharing audits of suppliers to affect policy change at governmental level. Based on a pilot project in Bangladesh, BSR is working with Abercrombie & Fitch, Levi Strauss, Timberland and local NGOs to improve women's health in Asian factories throughout the supply chain. BSR says the approach makes sound social and business sense, as both companies and female workers are benefiting from the project. For every US dollar invested in women's health, one Bangladeshi factory has seen a $3 return through higher productivity, lower staff turnover, and reduced absenteeism. So by working collaboratively to create a better supply chain, everyone involved in the chain benefits: the workers, the companies, the investors and consumers.
So the biggest challenge for us is really with the consumer. And it is to get consumers around the world to reward companies that try to improve labor standards in their factories and try to improve the environment as much as they reward companies that produce high fashion, inexpensive, quick-to-market products. So we need our consumers out there to reward the companies that work with BSR to raise environmental and labor standards.